This part of the tutorial focuses on pre-registration. We will first define what it is, why and how to pre-register, then mention some pre-registration platforms. We will then move on to templates, which can be used to pre-register studies, and discuss discrepancies between what is described in pre-registrations and what can happen in reality. We'll also mention registered reports, a publication format associated to pre-registration, and move on to what are the effects of pre-registering, but also its limits and criticisms. Finally, we'll quickly go through how to spot whether a study has been pre-registered based on the article in which it is reported. First thing here is to define what a pre-registration is. So here is one definition. Registering a study involves posting a public, time-stamped document online that details what the researchers are planning to do in advance of collecting any data. This document usually outlines plans regarding how data will be collected and analyzed. And what is great with a registered study is that because hypotheses are written and made public before the study is run, it allows us to see what hypotheses the researchers intended to test, so we can check if any of them were switched mid-study. In other words, it allows us to spot Texas sharpshooters. In particular, pre-registration is assumed to break the hierarchy process and limit the opportunity for other questionable research practices, including p-hacking and other forms of data torturing. In turn, it is supposed to improve the validity of frequent statistical tests. Overall, outside of these arguments focusing on how pre-registration improves scientific practices, pre-registration also participates in improving the transparency of the overall research process. So now, in practice, how to pre-register. Pre-registration is a fairly straightforward process. First, you need to write a pre-registration, which can be as simple as filling a fairly short and user-friendly questionnaire. This pre-registration specifies the research design and analysis plan. Then the second step is to post it on a discoverable repository before observing the outcomes of the study, which means before running any analysis on the data. Finally, you should report the results of all the planned analysis you described in the pre-registration. Pre-registrations should be specific, precise, and exhaustive. Specific means that the pre-registration is detailed in its description of all phases of the research process, from the design of the study to what will be reported in the manuscript. Precise means that each aspect of the research plan is open to only one interpretation. Finally, exhaustive means that each aspect of the pre-registered research plan explicitly excludes the possibility of deviations from this pre-registered research plan. What is in a pre-registration can also vary depending on the specific scientific field or case or template considered or used. Pre-registering usually involves registering the hypothesis and predictions, methods, and data analysis plan for the study. Finally, it is possible to register only part of these elements. For instance, as long as no one has looked at the data, it is okay to register predictions and data analysis plan even if the methods can no longer be pre-registered. This can happen in cases in which the data has already been collected for other purposes or by another research team. In this case, what matters is that the researchers who are registering the study and running the analysis are blind to whether the data would support the hypothesis they are planning to test. Pre-registrations can adjust to different types of doing science. The most classic formats for pre-registration focus on experimental research, and especially hypothesis testing experimental research, which also conforms kind of better to the ideal research life cycles we described earlier. Nevertheless, pre-registration can adapt to a larger diversity of research design, including qualitative research, research using pre-existing data, single case designs, or exploratory research. If the research you are conducting falls upon one of these categories, I invite you to consult the corresponding references and resources. There are also a number of pre-registrations that are publicly available and that you can consult freely on Open Science Framework's website. There are a number of platforms that you can use to pre-register a study before running it. All valid platforms for pre-registration will provide a timestamp on the pre-registration. Some platforms provide their own specific templates, which might be more or less fit for your study. In some cases, researchers might prefer having their pre-registration under embargo, with the pre-registration being made public only at a time decided by the researchers. In such cases, the pre-registration is recorded on the website or platform before the study, but made public only when researchers decide to do so, for instance, upon submitting their study for publication. This possibility to embargo registrations is one main difference between the different platforms. So if it's a feature that matters to you, you might want to check whether the platforms you are planning to use offer it. Which platform to use depends on your own preferences and the use you want to make of pre-registration. I mentioned some here that are frequently used in different fields. So for US-based clinical trials, it is mandatory to pre-register, and there is a dedicated website for that. Open Science Framework is another platform that offers a whole set of tools for reproducible science, and that includes pre-registration. We will come across OSF a number of times in the course, and I also invite you to watch the interview with Nick Fox from OSF if you want to know more about them. The Registry of Efficacy and Effectiveness Studies, REES, is hosted by the University of Michigan and is another option. So is Declare Design. AsPredicted.org is one of the most straightforward platforms and brings pre-registration down to a list of 8 questions. Pre-registration templates provide a convenient way to get started with pre-registration. Different templates can ask for more or less detailed input and offer more or less guidance on what there is to include. Some templates are also more specialized and more adapted to one field or one discipline in particular. Templates can be particularly useful as a way to be sure you are exhaustive in your pre-registration. And by contrast with templates, there's also the possibility to write up open-ended pre-registrations, which are free-form. One of the simplest and most straightforward template is As Predicted, which includes only 8 questions to answer. The questions are the following. 1. Have any data been collected for the study already? 2. What's the main question being asked or hypothesis being tested in the study? 3. Describe the key dependent variables specifying how they will be measured. 4. How many and which conditions will participants be assigned to? 5. Specify exactly which analysis you will conduct to examine the main question or hypothesis. 6. Any secondary analysis. 7. How many observations will be collected or what will determine the sample size. There is no need to justify the decision, but you need to be precise about exactly how the number will be determined. 8. Anything else you would like to pre-register. That can include data exclusions, variable collected for exploratory purposes, or any kind of unusual analysis planned. Another longer and more detailed template is the OSF pre-registration template. This template was used during the pre-registration challenge organized by Open Science Framework. And this template is a fairly classic one. It is especially fit for experimental studies. I indicate in bold which parts are mandatory and the other parts are the optional ones. Starting with the general study information, you need to at least enter the title, authors, and hypothesis of your study. You can also, if you want to, provide a description of the study. I'll describe a totally hypothetical and very simplified study here, just so that I can show you what a pre-registration could look like. Let's say we are registering a study with the title Primed by the Dinosaur, the effect of seeing carnivorous or herbivorous dinosaurs on food preference. I'll also input the authors. Now, our hypothesis here is that participants who see herbivorous dinosaurs will rate a subsequent picture of a salad as more appetizing than participants who will see carnivorous dinosaurs. The next part of this template is the design plan. It requires to state the study type, whether it is experimental, observational, meta-analysis, or any other type. It also requires us to describe the blinding used by the study, if there's any. The last mandatory element for this part is the study design. If applicable, you can also add more details about any additional blinding procedures or randomization. So for our hypothetical study, the study type is an experiment. The only blinding we use is that participants do not know the treatment group they have been assigned. They don't know that another treatment with other type of pictures of dinosaurs exists. Design-wise, our study uses a between-subject design with two conditions. Either herbivorous or carnivorous dinosaur pictures are displayed. Third part of the OSF pre-registration would be your sampling plan. The mandatory parts of a sampling plan include describing any existing data, data collection procedures, and sample size. Optional elements would include justifying the existing data, providing the sample size rationale, and, if applicable, describing a stopping rule. Back to our dinosaur and food evaluation study, we have no existing data to report. Information on our data collection procedures could be something like participants will be recruited among students of the Complexity Explorer online course, participants must be at least 18 years old and need to not have any specific dietary restrictions, they should be omnivorous, and they will not be paid for their participation. Final required piece of information is the sample size, area of, let's say, 120 participants with 60 participants per condition. We can also mention details such as that we will attempt to recruit up to 150, assuming that not all participants will complete the task. Now, these numbers are totally arbitrary, but if I had based them on poor calculations or existing literature, I could mention that as part of the sample size rationale. The fourth part of the pre-registration is describing the variables you will use. The only mandatory variables are the ones you will measure. If applicable, manipulated variables and indices can also be included. In our case, we have a manipulated variable, so even if it's not a mandatory part of this template, we need to fill it. We manipulate which type of dinosaurs the participants saw, either seeing Diplodocus and a Brachiosaurus for the herbivorous condition, or Tyrannosaurus rex and a Velociraptor for the carnivorous condition. Our measured variable is the perceived tastiness of a pictured salad, rated by the participants on a 0 to 100 scale, with 0 being not tasty at all and 100 being very tasty. Finally, the last part of the OSF pre-registration template focuses on your analysis plan. The only mandatory part of it is to describe your statistical model. But if relevant, you can also mention transformations, inference criteria, data exclusion, missing data, and exploratory analysis. There's also a possible other part if you need to add anything else. So the only mandatory part here is the statistical models we will use. Yet it's also one of the most important part of the pre-registration, and it calls for being as precise as possible. For our example, we would run a one-tailed t-test, which we justify by mentioning that our hypothesis is directional. We predict that herbivorous dinosaurs should lead to a higher rating of tastiness for the salad picture. This t-test will be run on ratings of the salad's tastiness, which is our dependent variable, and it will also be run between the two groups, herbivorous and carnivorous, which constitute our independent variable. Pre-registrations describe ideal cases, and a number of things can diverge from pre-registration while running studies. This is one of the main reasons why pre-registration is sometimes seen as especially difficult, inapplicable, or inefficient. We have now seen what pre-registrations look like. One concern about pre-registration is that pre-registrations can only describe ideal cases. One recurrent objection to pre-registration is that it is not flexible enough to accommodate how research processes might work in reality. One well-cited article on pre-registration, entitled "The Pre-registration Revolution," highlights a number of cases in which the reality of running a study might depart from what has been considered in the pre-registration, and also addresses what to do in each case. So first case, some changes are made to procedure during study administration. Second case, during analysis, some assumption violations are discovered. Third case, data were already collected. This can happen in a number of cases, including if the data were collected by another researcher or research team. Fourth case, you are running a longitudinal study and the study design might undergo some changes between the different waves of the study. Fifth case, you run many experiments and feel like writing pre-registration for each one of them would take up too much of your time. Sixth case, different theories or agents involved in the research project have competing predictions. Now, going through the different solutions that can be used for each of these issues, First, when changes to the procedure occur during study administration, you should report and justify these changes. Same thing if you discover that your data violates some assumptions during analysis. Just report the assumption violations and justify any departures from the analysis plan. Now, if data were already collected, this isn't really a problem as long as the data hasn't been looked at. In the case of longitudinal studies with changes to the procedure occurring between different waves of the study, it is possible to simply have different per-registrations for the different waves. In the case of having many experiments, it is possible to have one main per-registration for the common structure of these experiments, with smaller registrations focusing only on the specifics of each experiment. Finally, having competing predictions is far from being a problem. You can simply register all predictions, even if they seem contradictory. Registered reports are a type of publication offered by some journals. In the case of pre-registered reports, authors first send a manuscript that includes their introduction and methods, pretty much a pre-registration document, to the journal. This manuscript is then peer-reviewed and given an in-principle editorial decision based on the introduction plus how robust do the methods and analysis plans seem to be. If accepted, the authors can then simply go on and collect their data, analyze it, write up the results and discussion. Then the full manuscript is sent back to the journal and reviewers. At this stage, reviewing aims more at checking whether methods and analysis plan have been followed correctly than what the results per se are. One interesting case study to get an idea of what are the actual consequences of pre-registering at the population level is to look at what happened for clinical trials. So pre-registration became mandatory for clinical trials in 2000, and the main consequence seems to have been that a lot more of the results that are reported after 2000 are actually null rather than being selected for positive results. That's how pre-registration is supposed to help against the file drawer or publication bias. Eric Wagenmakers also proposed a number of selfish reasons to adopt pre-registration, and the reasons he put forward actually apply mainly to registered reports formats, more than to all types of pre-registrations. So they are the following. One, you can take credit for your predictions because they were publicly recorded. Two, when your results from data analysis are in, you can experience the excitement without worrying about what they are and whether they will mean that your study won't be publishable. Three, it prevents data from taking you hostage. Four, you can use a lot of free and easy to access online resources. Five, it can increase your reputation and your self-esteem. Six, you can wait for your results to come in without fear, as you already have in principle acceptance. And finally, 7, it also protects you against postdoc critique. Now, I have been pre-registering for a while, so there are a few benefits I've found in doing it for myself. Some of these untold benefits include avoiding to create designs that you cannot analyze, because usually you could spot them while you're writing up your pre-registration. Pre-registration also facilitates discussions with collaborators, including about possibly touchy topics like authorship. And finally, I would also argue that it can help with writing up papers, because personally I enjoy writing about projects a lot more before I know the results than after I do. On the other hand, there has been a number of limits and criticisms of pre-registration. The first limit of pre-registration that has been voiced is that adherence to pre-registration is difficult and rare. Klezen and colleagues looked at a sample of psychological studies who obtained a pre-registration badge, which means that the studies were pre-registered and fulfilled some additional requirements for a journal to give them this badge. Their studies showed that studies following their registrations are actually the exception more than the norm, and departures from registered plans aren't always disclosed. Other arguments have suggested that pre-registration works best for confirmatory experimental research and doesn't necessarily work for all fields. It is also unclear how much pre-registration can actually do to ensure sound statistical testing. And finally, another pretty tongue-in-cheek study demonstrated that it is still possible to engage in questionable research practices even after having pre-registered the study. Bottom line here is pre-registration scientific goals were mostly in response to the replication crisis, but it also contributes to open science by increasing the transparency of the research process. You may also want to be able to evaluate as a reader or as a reviewer whether a study has been pre-registered or not. And that's what we will look into now. We will be taking one of my own articles as an example. The paper I used for this example will be linked below the video. The first thing is that the pre-registration is mentioned in the manuscript's text and a link to the pre-registration is provided. And the link works. Now we can compare the dates between the pre-registration and the dates the manuscript was received by the journal. Here, the study was pre-registered end of June 2018 and the manuscript received by the journal in January 2020, which is coherent. So that's a kind of first level of easy checking that is really quick to do as a reader. And there's a more in-depth check that you can do by comparing the design analysis plan that were registered to what is actually reported in the article.